Okay, well, thank you very much for that intro, Eric. I should point out that throughout this paper, I'm going to be using the words banner and flag somewhat interchangeably. So in all 1850s references, contemporaries used the word banner, possibly to avoid the appearance of disloyalty to the existing British flag. However, the design of the item that I'm talking about, this one, the Australasian League flag, although I'll be moving on and talking about all sorts of other instances of this in future, which has mounting points on the left-hand edge, designates that this item is a flag rather than a banner in standard vexillological terminology. I don't know if this is the first time you've had a vexillology lecture here, but it's a good word. About this one is that the League deliberately put the Union Jack in the top left to show that this was not a flag of rebellion. This was a deliberate attempt to show loyalty to the Crown. What they were asking for was colonial self-determination, not colonial independence, which is interesting when you look at that quote from the US when they're talking about that and saying that they will soon be a independent confederation like us. That wasn't actually what the League was asking for. They were asking for a degree of political self-determination in the form of something like a legislative council. So it was meant to be, it was there specifically, John West actually said, to show that this is not a flag of rebellion. I think it's a very interesting point that this is prior to the Eureka flag, which was a flag of rebellion, tends to be the flag, the Australian historical flag, that gets focused on more. But in terms of actual impact, the big impact of Eureka wasn't actually the rebellion, it was the court cases afterwards. The big impact of this was it was the first movement for Australasian self-determination. So it actually arguably had a far greater impact on the politics of Australia than something like Eureka did. It's just that because it was a campaign carried out not by a bunch of uppity miners who wanted to be middle class, but by a group of actual middle class, largely gentlemen and mechanics, those who were not willing to form a militant group, it actually had a greater impact on Australian politics in the long run. To many friends for suggestions, but the banner in effect came from his valued friend, Mr. West. It was his proposal to give a flag to the people of Victoria, and they had received one in return. He hoped that all the colonies would make a similar interchange. They were indebted to Dr. Greaves, the ex-mayor of Melbourne, for the suggestion of the Southern Cross. So this is interesting. So it appears to have been West's instigation, but a bit of a committee effort in actually coming up with the design. So on January the 27th, a meeting of the Tasmanian Victorian delegates was held in Melbourne, at which it was resolved to initiate the Australasian League, with the public meeting set up for the following Saturday, February the 1st. And in the Port Phillip Gazette, they recorded, a meeting of the Tasmanian delegates and the General Committee of the Anti-Transportation Association was held in the Mechanics Institution yesterday. The Reverend John West, delegate for Hobart Town, in the chair, at which orders were given for the immediate preparation of a banner for the League. So, there is no currently known direct causal link between the design of the current Australian flag and the Anti-Transportation League flag. None of the winners of the 1901 competition for the design of the nation's flag referred directly to the Anti-Transportation League flag. Some may not even have been aware of the Australasian League flag's existence. However, a look at the continuance of the use of the iconography of the flag and the appearance of the design or elements of it in many places argues fairly strongly for a link through the design's existing presence in the public consciousness. The fact that 5 people independently submitted essentially the same design suggests that the idea of a, quote, defaced British ensign, that's the vexillological term for when you've actually done this, I'm not being rude, together with the Southern Cross, represented in its natural formation, was actually well established in the public consciousness. A further factor muddying the waters of the debate around the flag design is, of course, the flag of New Zealand. This too bears a striking similarity to the Australasian League flag, and again, given New Zealand's part in the League, this may be more than a coincidence. So interestingly, the New Zealand flag design was in common use on ships earlier than the Australian version, despite it only being officially adopted in 1902, 1 year after the Australian flag. The New Zealand flag was designed by Admiral Sir Albert Hastings Markham, and he served at Australia's Station in 1868, where he helped suppress blackbirding, the illegal trading of slaves between Queensland and the South Sea Islands. While he was there, he came up with the design, this one, which he submitted to the Governor of New Zealand in 1869. This design was adopted and put into use, although it didn't actually become official until 1902. The design of the New Zealand flag features the Southern Cross with 4 stars rather than the 5 used on both the ATL flag and the official Australian flag. However, it should also be noted that the initial design for the Australasian League flag also featured only 4 stars of the cross. And both these designs feature the Southern Cross with 4 stars in their natural formation rather than stylised. So this raises the question, how much does the current Australian flag owe to the New Zealand joining the Australasian League? It's also interesting to note, as reflected by the New Zealand flag itself, that the Southern Cross itself appears to have been regarded as being 4 stars only, with the 5th only added consistently to any iconography as a result of the Australasian League banner and its successors. So they only added it because New Zealand joined. The existence of the flag of New Zealand from 1869 would have ensured that the main elements of the iconography of the ATL flag continued to be seen on ships despite the Anti-Transportation League flag no longer being in use. So, 1 year after the development of the New Zealand flag, another design bearing a striking similarity to the Australasian League flag came into use. The original Victorian flag, or ensign, proclaimed in 1870. The flag was intended for use by the first Australian colonial warship, HMVS Nelson, and red versions were also produced for the use by the mercantile marine. For those of you who don't know, the red version was always the people's flag, the one for the mercantile marine. The blue version was flown on warships. That's kind of changed a bit recently. So the imperial crown above the Southern Cross was added in 1877, which you see now on the Victorian flag, although the Victorian red ensign without the crown was used on commercial shipping right up until Federation. Seems very reasonable assumption that designers of the original Victorian flag would have been aware of and influenced by the Australasian League design, which had been so prominent in their state less than 20 years earlier, as well as having seen other examples of similar designs in use. Right, the Southern Cross in its natural form was briefly featured also on the first flag of Tasmania, which was proclaimed by the governor Sir Frederick Weld on the 9th of November 1875. This flag was not approved by the Secretary of State for the Colonies in London, and the current Tasmanian flag, featuring the lion rampant, was adopted in 1876. I mean, you can kind of see why this didn't survive. It's not a particularly elegant flag. So, further adding to the evidence for the continuance in the public consciousness of the iconography of the Australasian League flag design is an object in the collection of this museum, of the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery. This is the Launceston Artillery Challenge Cup of 1882. And it's unusual in that, unlike the other known examples of this trophy, of which we hold 2, it was made interstate in Melbourne. So this was made by Edwards and Call, prominent Melbourne silversmiths. But what's interesting about it, and one of the main reasons I was actually really keen to collect this item, is that it features a pair of crossed flags on the base in enamel and gold. One flag is, of course, the Union Jack. But the second one resembles the Victorian ensign as it appeared at the time, a design with the Union Jack in canton, so top left, and the Southern Cross represented naturalistically on the fly. Other than the Victorian ensign, no official flag bearing a naturalistic Southern Cross existed at this time. Nevertheless, the flag on this trophy is described in newspaper articles as being respectively, quote, the Southern Cross flag, that was in the Tasmanian, the 10th of February 1883, and the Australian ensign, also in 1883. This gives further credence to the idea of the common currency of this design of flag prior to the design of the official Australian flag in 1901. The use of the term Australian ensign is interesting here, as this usually refers to a modification of the former colonial national flag, the one I showed you before, the British white ensign with a blue cross of St George carrying 5 white 8-pointed stars. The flag's use on vessels was prohibited by the British Admiralty in 1883 due to its claimed similarity to the Royal Navy's white ensign. So this is another intriguing object, currently privately held, although I understand it's recently been purchased by a museum. I just need to actually get the details on this. It's also showing the continuance of the design. This artefact is a ceremonial pedestrian belt, the Grand Challenge Belt of Australasia, awarded in 1886 to W. Clark by the Committee of the Flemington Running Grounds for a 120-yard running race. And what's interesting about it, of course, it features once again 2 enamelled flags. I would be very, very surprised if these weren't done by the same enameller. There's only so many people capable of this type of work in Melbourne at the time. So one is, of course, the Union Jack, but the other is a defaced British ensign with the Southern Cross with all 5 stars on the fly. Most Australian vexillographers recognise a clear lineage between the Australasian League flag and the current national flag. So Australian flag historian John Vaughan says, the Australasian Anti-Transportation League flag of 1851 does have a claim to having a direct lineage to the Australian national flag since 1901. Having researched the history of the various flags of Australasia for decades, the lineage is evident for all to see who studied the early flag designs of Australia and New Zealand. While this seems an understandable and intuitive assumption, given the similarity of the flags, a direct connection is actually much harder to establish. This is why groups like the Australian national flag, what are they called? There's the Australian National Flag Society, I think it is, do not agree with my contention here. So the current design for the Australian flag was arrived at through a national government-sponsored federal flag competition in 1901. The competition attracted 30,000 entries from all around Australia, and the £200 prize was shared between 5 entrants. Ivor Evans, a 14-year-old schoolboy from Melbourne, Leslie John Hawkins, a teenager apprenticed to a Sydney optician, Egbert John Nuttall, a Melbourne architect, Annie Dorrington, an artist from Perth, and William Stevens, a ship's officer from Auckland, New Zealand. The Weekly Times commented, many of them have discarded precedent altogether, and fearful and wonderful indeed to behold are many of the products of their imagination. Many of the designs submitted can only be regarded as miracles of misplaced ingenuity. That's not referring to the the ones that won. This is referring to some of the other designs. However, on choosing these 5 designs, the judge's report read in part, it was apparent that a Commonwealth flag to be representative should contain the Union Jack on a blue or red ground, a 6-pointed star representing the 6 federated states of Australia directly under the Union Jack, and the Southern Cross on the fly as being indicative of the sentiment of the Australian nation. So we could actually regard this as, if this was what was meant to be representative, it's really limiting the number of designs you can come up with those elements. One could almost say the competition was slightly rigged. The winning flag design was, of course, strikingly similar to the Australasian League flag and also to the flags of Victoria and New Zealand. The problem is, of course, that there is no direct evidence that the Australasian League flag influenced any of the 5 successful designers of the Australian flag. There appear to be no newspaper interviews with or articles about the winners that may shed any light on their creative processes. This was simply not the journalistic style of the day. Ivor Evans' father reportedly had a flag-making business in Launceston, so there may be a pretty reasonable expectation that he was aware of the original Tasmanian design. Despite an extensive search, neither myself or others have been able to find any publication printed prior to 1901 that may have shown the Australasian League flag, with the exception of the League letterhead itself. All entrants would, however, have been aware of a Victorian flag, with its similar use of the Southern Cross, and this must have been an influence on the design process. The Victorian ensign appears to be the most likely lineage connecting the Australasian League flag in the Kiwi Mag's possession to the current Australian national flag. A similar connection through the New Zealand flag is also plausible. The involvement of New Zealand in the Australasian League means that they would have been aware of the ATL banner in the mid-19th century. The use of the New Zealand flag prior to its official adoption does raise the question of the awareness of the design in New Zealand as well. So, in conclusion, I think it can be very plausibly argued that the Australasian League banner was a strong influence on the designers of the Victorian flag, and that the connection between the Victorian flag and the current Australian national flag is pretty clear to see. I think I've exhausted everybody. Well, thank you very much for your attention.